Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be around the world. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Ask a Professional Scrum Trainer with Russell Miller. My name is Eric Naberg, and I'll be your host today. Russell has joined us, and you can hopefully see him there on the camera. And we'll take you through some topics. Hopefully you'll have lots of questions. We never seem to be short on questions. And hopefully Russell will give you some great answers as well. If we move on to the next slide. Just a little bit about this series. This is your opportunity to ask questions of our professional Scrum trainers. We run this once a month, and it really has become a great opportunity for folks to get some quick and easy help. And any questions we don't get to, we'll take afterwards, and Russell will be able to respond via email. It's going to provide you with the opportunity to listen and get some answers. Next slide. So just a little brief about who is Scrum.org. We're founded by and run by Ken Schwaber. Ken is a co-creator of Scrum. He introduced Scrum back in 1995 at UPSLA and really has continued to drive it globally around the world. The author of the Scrum Guide, global speaker and presenter, and of course the original Scrum trainer. Scrum.org provides training, as you can see there, as well as certification around Scrum. We actually just introduced you, if you're familiar with us and you haven't been paying attention the last couple of weeks, we introduced a new class, PSU, Professional Scrum with UX, working with the authors of the Lean UX book to create a class and help people understand, for example, how UX members can be part of the Scrum team and work together, bringing practices into Scrum. Next slide. So I'll let Russell introduce himself, and then we'll get back for some questions. Russell?
Hi, I'm glad that you're taking the time to meet with us in Eastern time. It's this morning. A little bit about my background. It's useful to know the perspective that someone brings when they're answering questions or speaking on a particular topic. And so a brief bit about my background might be helpful to some of you. My training is in mechanical engineering. My career experience has been varied. I worked initially as a product design engineer for physical product development, not software product development. I've worked in the auto industry on internal combustion engine components. I've worked in the aerospace industry on luxury aircraft, on military aircraft, both transport and air dominance fighter aircraft. And I've got experience in service industry, in the supply and logistics around automotive replacement parts. Software development experience, I've got more than a decade of Scrum experience, so that's informed some of the answers that you get. I have experience in Agile transformation, which is a very popular topic, but it's a very challenging thing to execute depending on your environment. I have experience with team formation and development, as you see there, training material development for large organizations. I have experience with coaching, and obviously I have experience with training, and I'm thrilled to get this opportunity to speak with you today.
Great. So if we can go on to the next slide. So hopefully that gave you some good background on Russell and some of his experiences. So we're open for questions. Your microphones will be muted throughout. However, you can type your questions in the chat box. So you can see there actually the question box, not the chat box. There are two different boxes. You can see there the questions, enter your question, and send it on your way, and we will start taking questions. And of course, they are already coming in. So first question, let's just go through this real quick. So this is an interesting one. How do we get consensus with sprints? So stakeholders want things delivered more quickly, say 2-week sprints, yet the development team wants to work in a longer duration, say a 4-week sprint. How do we work with the team to get consensus on what our sprint lengths should be?
That's a good question, because you have, if I unpack that a little bit, you have two conflicting needs. You have the need expressed by some of the development team members, and I'm going out on a very short limb and say that the reason they want to have longer sprints is because they feel like they need to have the additional time to actually bring things to a done state. And then stakeholders, they'd love a sprint that was 15 minutes long. We leave the meeting and your sprint's complete and the work is in a done and releasable state. So I think it's probably not a quick fix. I will presume that the development team members have good, valid reasons why they're concerned about shorter sprint lengths. And so the Scrum, a good thing to consider is how long can we have the sprint and get the value to a done state and deliverable, but also have it be short enough to be responsive to the business needs. Now, that's a big framing of the question. So I think as a long-term goal, you want to, as a Scrum Master or as a development team member, you want to work with the whole Scrum team, but especially with the development team, on the technical practices that would enable more responsiveness. And so you can find those on the web. I'll provide some of them offline. So part of that's technical practices. Part of that is teaming. If in fact I would look and want to make sure you have all the skills in the team necessary to deliver a done increment, because if you don't, those dependencies are going to create a need on the development team member's part to extend the sprint length. So as a long-term thing, you want to think about technical practices, and not just technical practices, but attitudes and understanding about architecture and design. You also want to look at the state of your requirements when you're ingesting them and make sure we don't want big upfront design, but we certainly want requirements that are well understood enough so that we don't spend a lot of time during the sprint unnecessarily on that. So long-term, technical practices helping the development team get faster. I think that's really the gist of the question. Your stakeholders are going to want things as fast as they can get them. And maybe one missing ingredient that I'll add to this is maybe you could have your stakeholders help you understand exactly what the benefits to the business are of these short sprint lengths. Because if the development team fully understands how significant their impact is to the business if they deliver things in a quick cycle time, then necessity is the mother of invention. So if they really feel the need very strongly coming from the business stakeholders, that might motivate them to re-examine some of the practices. So there's no quick, easy, right or wrong answer, but I think that's a really fine question to start out with.
Yeah, I think it is. And one other thing to note there too is, and you just touched on it, Russell, which is, what are they looking for? What are stakeholders looking for? Because remember, we can deliver thousands of times during a sprint. We don't have to deliver once per sprint. So if they're looking for more frequent delivery, we can still do that within a 4-week sprint. It's just we're doing our planning on a monthly or 4-week basis. We're doing our reviews on that 4-week basis, but we can be delivering iteratively as we go throughout the sprint.
Well, I'm really glad you said that. So let me clarify an assumption that I made. The assumption that I made, and it may have been incorrect because we don't have this bi-directional feedback with the asker. We can do some of that offline. But the assumption that I made was that the development team members wanted the longer sprint length because they were only delivering at the end of the sprint. If you're delivering 3 times a day, then I'm not sure the sprint length would make as much difference to them. So that's an assumption I made, and it might be an incorrect assumption. So I appreciate you clarifing that for me.
Yeah, and I don't know either, but it's certainly something that popped into my mind.
Yeah, that's actually a long-standing misunderstanding. I think that when Scrum was developed, the environment was in the software development world was different, and it's changed a lot since then. And some folks get stuck on must be releasable at the end of the sprint, and they believe, oh well, that's the only time it needs to be releasable. But candidly speaking, it needs to be releasable as soon as the stakeholders need it to be releasable.
Yep. So staying with that theme, speaking of sprint lengths, do you see an issue with different Scrum teams within the same organization that are working on different sprint lengths? Does everybody in the company have to be in the same sprint length?
Right. They certainly don't. The keying in on some of the words you used, organization, is a word that you used, and you didn't use the word product. So we may have some large organizations that have different stakeholder groups and different stakeholder needs. And so if one group of stakeholders can work collaboratively with others to get to especially at the end of a sprint, a potentially releasable increment, then they can work in a 3-week sprint, and another team might be working in a 2-week sprint. The challenge comes, and I won't elaborate much on this here, but the challenge comes when you have a large product, a product that requires multiple teams' efforts, and then some teams want to work in one sprint length and some teams want to work at a different sprint length. That presents a different set of challenges that need to be understood and explained. But certainly you can have some teams working in a 4-week sprint length within a large organization and others at 3 and 2, and et cetera.
Great. So another question, this kind of goes over to the product owner, but I think this is more than a theoretical question. This comes up quite a bit. Is the product owner role a discrete skill itself? A lot of organizations are looking for someone to wear many hats, like software developer and product owner. But are there too many conflicts of interest? Of course, the answer is yes, there are a lot of conflicts of interest, but go ahead and elaborate.
Well, I think that large organizations, that's a good phrase, and I've heard it before. I think organizations are pretty efficient at addressing the conflict of interest questions. For instance, you may have one person that fulfills, if we exclude Scrum for just a minute and just talk about organizations, you might have one person and they'll have a single job title, but they may be performing 2 or 3 functions, or 4 or 5 or 6. And some could argue that some of those can conflict. And I think the larger organization, through their practices, or even a small organization through their practices, will make their values clear, and that gets sorted out. The question that comes up most often, which is the one you alluded to, is, on a Scrum team, how many of the Scrum roles can a person perform? So stepping back from that and considering the purpose of the roles, the product owner, which is the role that you mentioned, is responsible for the value that gets delivered and is accountable. Responsible is a word I use too loosely there. Accountable for the value that gets delivered. So if we deliver some valuable product that meets business needs, then the product owner can take credit for that. Likewise, if the solution is not meeting business needs, then the product owner needs to be appropriately held, accountable, and so inquiries can be made about what do we need to do to help. Or we have misalignment about what the goals were. So, back to the original question about the multiple roles, I don't really have that much of heartburn about a development team member also performing the product owner role, and the reason I don't is because the organization that wants to do that is living with that constraint, but presumably because of a pretty good reason. Now, ideally, you want to have someone that's performing the product owner role and not also a development team member role, so the focus can be on value rather than the execution and creation of the value. But no, I don't think that's the biggest problem that you have if you're trying to fulfill multiple roles.
Great. So another question. I work for a small engineering team, not that small, 50 people. It's actually a pretty good size. They've been doing Scrum formally for about 15 months, but I just joined the team and recently came on board and delivered some high-level basic training and want to get some more formal training and get the team working. Where should I start? Should I start with the Scrum Masters, the product owners, the development team? How do I start getting folks up to speed to make sure they're all on the same speaking the same language, are all on the same page?
That's a great question. Well, if you want training tonight, or today, then I suggest you go to the Scrum.org website and avail yourself of some of the fantastic material there. And that's no hyperbole. There's some great material there. There's also some great books that are referenced there. If you look at the different domain areas, and I want Eric, I want you to piggyback on this with our learning paths. But if you look at the different areas of the website in the different roles, then you will see training material and books and webinars, etc., that are focused on that. And so now this is some personal advice. Ken Schwaber and Mike Beadle wrote a book, and it's actually my favorite. It's only, unless something's changed in the last 2 months, it's only available in print and not in Kindle or some Mobi format or any other kind of electronic format. But I commend it to you. I'm looking on my shelf to see if I have a copy of it, but I'll put it in the chat window. So that book explains the need behind iterative and incremental development better than any others. And so many people, and the reason I mention that is because many people get the practices of Scrum, but they don't understand the why. And even people that have been doing Scrum for 4 or 5 years, some of them sadly still get the practices, but if you don't understand the why, then you don't get the value out of it. So I'd start with the Scrum.org website. The Scrum Guide's only approximately 17 pages, and so I'd have everybody read that's interested. And then I would look at some training either in your area or in a place that's easy to get to for the people who are going to be you would consider the leaders of the effort. And I don't necessarily mean by role, I mean by influence. And see about getting them some Scrum.org professional Scrum training.
Yeah, and I agree. I'd start with the Scrum Guide, and what many organizations do to get this going is they print it and hand everybody a copy of it. So printing the Scrum Guide, getting everybody to have a copy and walking through it, and even if you're doing, whether it's formal or informal training within your organization, let's get people to start describing what's in the Scrum Guide. One of the exercises we do in our classes is we actually put the Scrum framework blank up on a wall and say, okay, draw it. So we just, whether it's on a whiteboard or just a blank sheet on the wall, and start drawing it and describing each of those events to get everyone talking the same language and on the same page. There are a ton of resources up on the Scrum.org website, all which are free. Learning paths, if you click resources for Scrum Masters, product owners, development team members, and so on, that drive a lot of the content home. And everything we do is based on a set of learning competencies and the focus areas. So that should be helpful for you. So moving forward, this is a question that comes up quite a bit, I think. How do we maintain transparency when the development team members informally are sharing portions of an upcoming increment before sprint review without telling other members of the Scrum team?
I'm going to think about that just a moment.
Not a problem.
So you got a couple of things going on there. The first thing that I would want to know is why that's happening. If you understand, that might be the shortest route to a solution. If you understand why that's happening, and if you believe that is there's a good need, why the happening is the sharing of the information, not the not telling others. That's a different question. But so I guess that's really what's the problem. Is the problem that they're sharing it, or is the problem that they're not telling others? So the not telling others, there's no good excuse for that. So you really want to ask two questions, and I think I'll make this answer short. Why are they sharing it? So let's understand that, and that's not necessarily a problem, but it could be a problem. If they're sharing it and they're not telling others, and they're intentionally not telling others, then that's something's not quite right there. And then the other question you want to ask is not only why are they sharing it, but why are they not sharing it with the rest of the team? And hopefully there's a simple and benign reason for that, and that can be easily remedied. But it's possible there's a more complex answer to that question. And right, software, we solve complex problems with people, and most of our problems are not, the big hurdles aren't technical, they're personal and human. And so understanding what their needs are for keeping that secret will probably take you a long way towards solving that problem.
Yeah, I think that's a great answer, Russell. And obviously start with the most transparent thing, which is the backlog, making sure that is transparent and available to everybody. But I think you're right. It's why are they avoiding some of the Scrum team when they're sharing this, because sharing with stakeholders is great, getting feedback is great, and it doesn't have to wait for sprint review to share. We should always be sharing and always be transparent, but they need to be transparent with the whole team, not carving out little groups, because then that actually starts to diminish it. One of the organizations I've worked with, we've got a great case study actually on a failure of Scrum and then why it succeeded up on our website, and I'll post it in the chat in a moment. It's from a company called Intralinks, and they did a Scrum reboot. And the reason they failed the first time is they realized they were not adhering to the Scrum values. And by not adhering to the Scrum values, they had instances like what the question just described. And when they did the reboot, they first thing they did, and over and over and over again, is they emphasize the Scrum values and why it is so important. Because what that lack of transparency is causing is a lack of trust quite often. And why is that happening? And let's dig into the why and keep going. But I'll post a link to that case study. It's a great case study for y'all to read.
Well, I'll add this quickly. You know, two of the Scrum values that come into, well, actually three of them that come into play here are courage and openness and respect. And if you're intentionally keeping things from people on the Scrum team, then that's certainly not openness, right? So we're going to throw a flag on not committing to that value. And then, if you don't communicate those things with some of your team members, then I'm sure they're not going to feel respected. And lastly, if there's some reason that's not being communicated that's not simple, something that's complex, then maybe there's a lack of courage, that there's an uncomfortable conversation that you're not willing to have, and you need to have the courage to, if it's important, and if team members are putting this question in the webinar, then I can guarantee it's important, then you need to have the courage to have that, what one author calls a crucial conversation.
Great. So there were a bunch of questions that are kind of along the same theme, so I'll kind of, I guess, summarize a little bit. They're really looking at how do we get the rest of the organization, the rest of the company, to align best with Scrum. So we're rolling out Scrum. We've got Scrum teams in place. We're working. But how do we get that alignment from the top down? How do we influence leadership to support it? And how do we, I guess, and one of the folks actually said, how do we sell it back up?
Yeah, that's a good question. Partly, so this is probably a specific answer, or some of the people are asking about their specific environment. So your mileage may vary, because I'm going to have to make a broad answer. But if an organization hasn't had enough experience yet with the success that can come from successfully executing and implementing Scrum, then you have one set of challenges. If you do have some prior success, then if the key stakeholders who benefited from that success are available and willing, then I would enlist their help. And the reason I say that is because they have experience speaking the language that other leaders and even executives understand, and those who are in different roles in an organization, individuals, contributors, don't always have the experience of knowing the issues that press upon organization leaders. And so often your stakeholders will have the experience to understand the things that are important to those leaders, and can be able to speak a language they understand. So I would enlist their help. If you don't have enough prior success within your organization, then there's a couple of things you can try, and this is not an inclusive list, but there's lots of case studies of success, and there are probably even case studies of success in aligned business areas. In other words, business areas that are aligned with yours. And so those can be useful. Beyond that, if you're just starting, then you're going to deliver software in 30 days or less. So that often is a change for some organizations, being able to meet business needs within 30 days. Now, some organizations are very agile already, and they're very successful already, and are at a different place in their Agile learning journey. But if you can deliver results in 30 days, again, to a stakeholder that has influence with the leaders, then paint the picture of what that's going to look like over time. We only have 30 days of success. Or if you had a 2-week sprint and you were able to deliver working software in 2 weeks, or if you're delivering 5 times a day, then take the success you have had, project that, expound upon that, and say, look, this is all we can see is this, all you can see is this, but here's what we project we're going to have if this continues. And that's, you want to deal with the fact, right? You don't want to deal with any kind of, well, we think this will work. Well, yeah, you think, but somebody else thinks it won't work. That's why you have the concerns you have. The last thing I'll leave you with, I think, on this topic is this: organizational change is very hard, but even sustaining change after it's been made is hard. So for those of you who are asking questions along these lines, let's imagine for a moment that you convince your leaders and you transform your organization and you're doing Scrum and you're delivering value very quickly. There are other organizations that have done that, and as Eric alluded to earlier, they've backslidden. They've slidden back down the hill from that success. And so it's a word of caution in that change is really hard, and sustaining the change once it's implemented is a challenge too. So when you're successful in implementing those changes, then you can't rest. You have to, it's probably even more important then to understand how you sustain the change, because the organization that created the situation that you have now and is successful with the skills and practices that are being used now, that organization is going to want to heal after Scrum is implemented, and it wants to return to the state it was in most cases before the implementation.
Yeah, that's great, Russell. Thank you. And it's evidence, right? Show it, prove that it's working, provide that evidence that we're getting better, we're delivering more value, that employees are happier, and all of those things to help drive that acceptance top down from the bottom up.
And I'll add one other thing, because as you talk, it's not that the current ways of operation are just pathetically horrible. I mean, most organizations are functioning and they're delivering value, and there's lots of different opinions about how that value could be delivered better. And so it's really and as Eric said, you need to argue based on facts and empirical evidence and things that can be measured.
Yeah, and getting feedback from customers. No better situation than when I was a product owner, being able to say, here are what our customers are saying. That holds a whole lot more weight than, oh, here's my opinion. So here's an opportunity for you to overcome a myth, Russell.
Okay.
Scrum says no hours will be calculated. So then how can I get estimates and costs? Well, I have nowhere. I just searched the Scrum Guide. I see no mention of not being allowed to use hours, but go ahead.
Sure. So the final question was, how do I calculate estimates and costs? Right.
Yes.
So I'm writing that down so I can be sure I answer that directly. So my favorite, there's lots of answers to this question. My favorite, first off, that's a myth. As you pointed out, Eric, that's not in the Scrum Guide, but it is there's a lot of myths. Some are more popular than others, but we've heard that before. So I can set your mind at ease that you don't have to be constrained by that. We need estimates in order to, in many cases, allocate funding for different efforts. And we also need estimates so that we can be able to let stakeholders have a glimpse for when the value that you are planning to deliver can be delivered. So you must have estimates. And my favorite answer is, well, how are you creating estimates now? And is that working for you? And if the answer is, well, we're creating this method and yes, it's working for us, then I would find out if there's any way you can still do that and use Scrum. And if there is, then do that to start out with. There's lots of different methods, and it's hard in a webinar format to list them all. But the methods that I use is I try to understand requirements at a reasonable level. I don't want to say high or low, but you certainly don't want to be too detailed in your requirements, or else you're doing a bunch of big upfront design, which I alluded to earlier. But development team members need to be able to understand enough about what is expected of them to deliver, so that they can create some high, medium level estimates, and so that we can plan the work, so you can have an idea and you can tell other stakeholders when the work might be delivered.
Great. So
I'm going to cut that one off.
No, that's cool.
Go ahead,
And
Eric.
I think that overall, you estimate how you need to estimate, and whether you're using story points or shirt sizes or whatever method that you decide, that's what's giving you the estimate. Because hours, I can guarantee you, if you estimate in hours, you will be wrong.
Right.
Because until you start working, you have no idea how long it's really going to take, which is why the ideas around sizing and using other ways to estimate sizing help you in that. So in Excel, we know about what that is, give or take, within plus or minus, but we're not saying it's going to take us 3 hours, because we know if we say it's going to take us 3 hours, it's probably going to take 4.5, or it may take 2. But if we're estimating that, and as we grow as a team, we become more comfortable with each other and being able to estimate together. But there is nowhere in Scrum that says you must estimate in this way, or you may not estimate in this way. So you can use, if hours works best for your team, go for it. Whatever is working best for the team is what you really need to do.
Well, right, and I would let me think about how I want to say this just a moment, Eric. So I'm always learning, and I'll stand to be corrected if it's with respect. I think that the team needs to understand that they have needs, but their stakeholders have needs too, and there's multiple stakeholders that interact with the team. So it may be that hours, might seemingly work great for the team, but you want to make sure that whatever estimating method you use meets the needs of other stakeholders. I strongly prefer, and most of my peers strongly prefer using story points. I didn't say all of my peers, and so there's lots of good reasons to do that, which are probably not something I want to go into here. But if it's working for you and you're using hours, then I wouldn't obsess about that.
Yeah, agreed. And yeah, and the reason I don't like hours is, as I said, is it's certainly, you're generally going to be wrong, because there's no plus or minus when you say 3 hours.
Yeah.
So anyhow, we can move on. But so this is a great question. Again, there's a bunch of questions that are similar to this, so I'll kind of summarize. But it's about distributed teams. Do you have suggestions on how to best communicate and how to best work when you've got teams made up of people in different geographies, different locations, trying to work together as a single Scrum team?
Yeah, that's a very, very a common question, because it's such a real problem. If there's only an hour time zone difference between the two teams, and I said the two teams. Let's imagine the simplest case is you have, well, I guess the simplest case would be you have non-co-located teams in the same time zone, and that's probably the simplest manifestation of the problem. Or maybe even the simpler might be people spread throughout a single building that are in the same time zone. I think that it's an extra challenge for communication, and the reason it's an extra challenge is because so much of human communication is in the context of how things are communicated. So there's a lot of nonverbal. A lot of people talk with their hands, and they can get, if you're talking face to face, you can get feedback, right? So Eric, if you're saying something and I have a question about it or wonder about it, you're going to see it in my eyebrows and in my smile and in my, and if I'm speaking, Eric, and you're rolling your eyes, then that's saying a lot. You didn't say anything, but you said a lot. So I think it's not always obvious to people how how difficult it is when you can't have the face-to-face communication. So things are often misunderstood. So what do you do to overcome that? So video technology is some of my favorite, because you can see the person or person's faces when you're speaking, and you get a lot of immediate, even nonverbal feedback. So technology is your friend there. We've got a lot of modern tools, like Teams and Slack and other kind of tools, which allow a lot of chat-like conversation that retains a thread on a topic, and I'd use that. When time zones become a problem, then you have to be creative, and frankly, you're going to pay a price. You have folks located in different parts of the world for good business reasons, but that doesn't come for free, and so you need to have probably more checkpoints, more scheduled checkpoints than you would otherwise. Daily Scrum, you got to find a time that's helpful, but if your time zones are too far apart, then, as you know, the problem are one team's beginning their day and another team has just completed their day. So I think that one piece of free advice I'll give about that topic is, have some team member and ask them to shepherd that issue for a period of time. Have it their responsibility to focus on communication and report in the daily scrums and at the sprint review about communication among the team members, and have other team members bring their concerns and complaints about that to that person who's shepherding the issue. And then you'll want to rotate and have somebody else shepherd the issue. And what you get from that is you get someone who would ordinarily be focused on other things as part of their commitment to their Scrum team members. Is they're now, for a period of time, they're focused on communication. And when they have to wear that hat and walk in those shoes for a while, they learn, and over the period of time, if you rotate through that, then everybody has a greater appreciation for the challenges and are better, more sensitive to it. And we don't want one person being I'm going to be the communication guru because my brain is bigger than everybody else's. It's the same way we want to approach all of our team problems, in that we want to use the collective intelligence of the whole team. And by rotating those responsibilities, that's one way you can tap into that collective intelligence.
Great, thank you. So another question here: do we really need to spend so much time working in meetings, especially, for example, sprint planning?
Right, that's a great question. Some things are easily measured, and the things that are easily measured are things that we can either more easily take credit for or we can point to. And time is critical, and that's the one resource that none of us can get any more of, right? We have 24 hours in the day. So in my experience at multiple organizations, I've found that, and candidly, I've been guilty of not explaining this well enough on multiple occasions. The sprint planning meeting, there's two parts to that meeting, right? There's the what are we as a Scrum team going to accomplish, do we forecast we're going to accomplish, and the second half of that is how do we intend to accomplish that. And I think the what we're going to do, the choosing items and negotiating which items come in to a sprint, is obvious. It's the how are we going to get it done that the reason for that is not always well understood. And what I've found is that the design work that happens during the sprint planning meeting, whether it be on a whiteboard or using electronic means or on a piece of paper, where different Scrum team members get together and they're talking, the product owner is available to them, they are refreshing their memory on the specific requirements, they're probably identifying acceptance criteria that haven't been considered yet, they're asking detailed questions that perhaps had been put off and forgotten to be elaborated on, or others simply that hadn't occurred before. And so the critical thing that's happening there, in my opinion, is that you're giving feedback to the product owner. The product owner is able to hear this feedback. Okay, I hear you're going to do X and you're going to do it by using Y method, and then you're going to interface with this other system, and the user is going to see this. And what that does that is not apparent is it gets the brain of the product owner engaged on that requirement at that moment, and many times the requirements or acceptance criteria come out in the sprint planning meeting that had not been communicated before, not because they've been withheld, but simply because as the product owner learns more about how something might be executed, he or she also learns more about their needs. And so the common pitfall is to think, well, if we do it just like was specified in the requirement, then we really don't need all this. The product owner probably doesn't care how we're going to do it. But it's not because he or she doesn't care. It's because the rehearsing of that in front of them causes them to think of things they hadn't thought of before, and it happens over and over and over again. The alternative, you asked about the time. The alternative is, well, we don't spend the time in sprint planning because we think the time is so valuable there, we're going to spend it elsewhere. But then as the product owner learns more during the sprint, right, because he's seen some concepts, or he's seen some prototype work, or he's seen some initial designs, then you're going to get those needs that we could have uncovered in sprint planning are going to come out during the sprint, or worst of all would be after the solution is in production. But backing up from that, you might learn in the sprint review, and you want to learn that as early as possible. So there's a real good reason that investment in time pays off in sprint planning. And lastly, here's the thing: it won't pay off every time. So you have sprint planning, and you go this great detailed explanation for how you're going to accomplish something, and you don't get any new requirements. And you think, well, gosh, that was a waste of time. Well, the question is not just one sprint planning meeting or two sprint planning meetings, is what are, like I have an insurance for my car. Is that a waste of money, right? I have health insurance for a catastrophic. Is that a waste of money? So I'm expending something that I could be using somewhere else, but I'm doing it because I expect that I'm probably going to need it. And yes, I have needed health insurance, and yes, I have needed car insurance. And so the time you spend in sprint planning, it pays off. There's a reason that there's some time references mentioned in the Scrum Guide. It's because of long experience about how much time is required to accomplish those things. So it was a really long-winded answer, but it was one that was close to my heart. So thanks, Eric.
Great, thanks, Russell. So this one, again, this is another one I've seen a bunch of different kind of questions around this. So I'll use this particular question and summarize a little bit. But what's your opinion around Agile transformation? Now, I hate, personally, I'm not a big fan of the word transformation, because I think you need to transition, because you're not going to just, to me, transformation means we're going to take everything and just change it, and that generally fails. But anyway, around Agile transformation, do we do immersion training and pull everybody out? Or do we do transformation as a whole? Do we take small teams within a protected Scrum bubbles? And do you have some guidance around how do we set up that transformation? How do we get it started? And what are some good ideas and suggestions around it?
So start with a disclaimer that it can be approached many ways, and you can achieve success using many methods. However, some methods are more likely to give you success, and the approach that I prefer is the Scrum Studio approach, where you, if Scrum isn't well understood in an organization, then you I'd create what is called a Scrum Studio, and you have folks in that studio work according to the Scrum Values and use Scrum and deliver success, and then grow from the Scrum Studio. Now, yeah, there's lots of reasons why a company might not want to do that, right? You want change to happen more quickly, and that's great if you can sustain that buy-in. Change is hard and it's costly and it's impactful. And so, yeah, you can do a big bang and have everybody in the company get Scrum training, and you can get success with that, but that change is hard for a lot of people, and so you're going to have a lot of people that are going to have a lot of questions and are going to need coaching and training, and you also need somebody who's going to sustain that kind of a change. So, we talk about, in business, to talk about organic growth, right? Growth into aligned areas of business, and that's what I often think of, although I'm not sure it's not espoused in any of our literature, is that kind of organic. We have one team and get them successful, and then we grow from there.
Great, thanks, Russell. So another question. So we're doing review, then retro, then sprint planning on one afternoon for a 2-week sprint. What's the best order that you see? Actually, there's a myth in this question. It says retro, review, then planning, as the Scrum Guide says, or review, then planning, then retro, because we can discuss in the retro impediments and other things ahead of planning. Just to be clear, the reason the Scrum Guide has planning listed first is because planning kicks off the sprint. Once you start planning, you're now planning your sprint. You're in the sprint. Where review and retro, those are about the previous sprint. But I'll let you take the actual question here, which is, do you have a preferred order, a recommended best way to handle the different Scrum events?
Yes, I'm curious to know what so I'll answer, Eric, and you can clarify the question for me. But I always, so there's two things. There's the practice, right? The cadence that you set up, and then there's what you do when there's some, major business need, or everybody's away on training on a particular day, and there's lots of things that come up that you need to be flexible with. But as a practical cadence, you begin the sprint with sprint planning, just as you said. At the end of your sprint time box, then you conduct a review, and I conduct the retrospective after the review, because there's more learning that happens in the review that you want to retrospect on. So that's the order that I always prescribe. But when you have a certain special thing, then you have to adapt to that. So I'm confused as to why the questioner would consider alternate orders. Was that clear at all to you, Eric?
It wasn't. It was more looking for just suggestions and recommendations.
Well, then in that case, what I'll add is that if you have an effective sprint review, then you're going to be looking at the probable content of the next sprint, and you're going to be getting feedback on the increment that was just made done. And so both of those activities are useful things because, for instance, if you had very happy customers in a sprint review, then that's great. If you had very unhappy customers in a sprint review, then that's something that you want to discuss in a retrospective. And if you just had the retrospective and didn't discuss that because you didn't know your stakeholders were unhappy, then there's a change opportunity that you've missed, because you've just spent that time of the retrospective probably not working on. If you have very unhappy customers and didn't know it, then you probably weren't working on the right thing during the retrospective if you had it before the review.
Great. So here's another question. It's really, and again, I've seen a couple of similar questions around the definition of done. So how much should be inside your definition of done? What all needs to be done? In this case, updating manuals, the packaging, functional testing, unit testing. How much needs to be in your definition of done?
So I'm really glad that question was asked. Here's the concept, and your definition of done should grow over time. So the first thing that I would suggest is that you have one, and you who asked the question maybe already have one, so you think, well, of course, I've already got one, please move on. But I'm thinking about the other people on the webinar. Have a definition of done, and the definition of done needs to have the items in it that if those items are checked, yes, we did it, yes, we did it, yes, we did it, and did it to the quality expectations that you collectively hold to be important, then if you met that, then you could call the work done. So that's what should be in there. Now the question is, what if you're working in a state where you end your sprints and you don't have done software? Well, that's a different challenge. But what I'm suggesting to you is that it's a bit of a journey. And so your definition of done today, sometimes you want to do something that will stick. And so don't conceive everything that could possibly be included and go from having nothing in your definition of done to every single thing possible in the definition of done that can never be met. So have a definition of done that you can reach each sprint, and then begin to add the most important things to that. If you're in a Scrum Master role, then this is part of your responsibility to help the team identify the next most important thing that should be added to that, and it should grow over time. So to sum up, whatever is required to make the solution usable by your customers should be in your definition of done. So that would include, ideally, includes all testing. It includes if the customer can use it without documentation, and documentation is considered a nice to have. In other words, we don't really have to have documentation. If that's the case, then you don't have to have documentation in there. If you consider documentation a requirement and simply a requirement that we'll meet later, then documentation should be in your today's definition of done.
Great. So another question here around retro, and this I've heard this come up a lot. How do we overcome a situation when a team thinks they're more mature than they really are, that they're mature enough and that retros aren't needed anymore? We've had 8 in a row and really haven't gotten any insight or optimization opportunities. How do we change that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I won't be quite as blunt as the question asker was, but although I have seen that before, what you want in a high-performing Scrum team is, and any kind of a team actually, is you want a commitment to continuous improvement. And where a Scrum Master or a development team member can make a big impact here is what I got from the question, what I heard from the question is some of our retrospectives haven't delivered a lot of significant improvements. And so I think that's where the problem lies, is every retrospective should end with not only an idea for what we want to improve, but a plan for how to implement that. And so there's a phrase that's used in a good book that I like about retrospectives, and it says to avoid the do nothing retrospective, where people talk and vent, but they don't come out of that with a plan. And so that just kills morale and esprit de corps, because you feel like you're wasting your time. So even if it's small, I suggest coming up with a specific improvement and a plan for it, and measure that and record it and keep a track of these improvements, and so people can see the improvements over time. And if you have team members who simply think we're good enough and don't need to improve anymore, you can have that from time to time. You can have people believe that from time to time. That's that's not a Scrum problem. That's a human problem, and that's a more complicated solution, right? If I'm working with a coworker and I think I'm trying to improve all the time and trying to learn all the time, and he thinks that he's already arrived, how to help that person understand how much better they could be is a particular challenge that I won't elaborate on here.
Great. So I think we probably have time for one, maybe 2 more. How do you respond when management demands to see the team's velocity metrics?
I give them to them.
There you go. Just I agree. I agree. The thing I also do is I caveat that, right? Because metrics for my team may be very different than metrics for your team, even though we're delivering the same amount. Because
right.
And this is where you need to caveat all of that, because each team's estimating on their own. So a 1 to me might be a 3 to you, which might be a 5 to another team.
Right. So So what's probably behind that is there's a concern that they're going to be asked to deliver more or a higher velocity, or their velocity, as you said, Eric, is going to be compared with another team. And those are common dysfunctions, but you know, need to understand why they're asking for it, and probably have a coaching, you know, opportunity with your stakeholders to explain what velocity measures and how velocity is different than value, and how it. So it's a problem probably for the asker, but it's also an opportunity to educate some stakeholders. But you got to give it to them, and you know, you got to be transparent with what's going on in the team.
Bingo. And I think that's a really important part there, which is we need to be transparent. We need to provide that information. That's what this is all about, is transparency, but we need to define it. And we need to define that information and what we're handing them, so that we're not just handing over something to be interpreted, because the last thing you want is to start interpreting that wrongly. So I think we've got time for one more, and this is a great question. I'm going to post in the chat a great webinar that ties to this as well. But how can business analysis, or here it's a business analyst, fit into Scrum? And there's a great webinar that our CEO Dave West did for around this, and where's my role, what's my role in Scrum. Remember, the roles in Scrum are not job titles, they're capabilities. And there's a lot of business analysis that has to happen for us to deliver products. So business analysis has to happen. Is your title business analyst? Maybe, maybe not. That depends on your organization. But Russell, I would love your take on that. I'll throw a link to this webinar in there as well.
So super quick background. I worked as a business analyst for several years and have passed the IIBA's Certificate of Competency in Business Analysis. And I meet with our local Atlanta chapter of the IIBA, which was, the last time I checked, the largest in the United States. So analysis is really close to my heart. Early on, Scrum teams wanted to kick analysts out of the team, because the method of delivering those requirements was different before Scrum came along. And but the analysis capability, the performing of the analysis, is a super critical role. The thing that I would caution you to watch out for as a development team member or as a Scrum team member is, Scrum doesn't have a role called analyst or business analyst. And so we expect the analysis to be performed by development team members and the product owner and people assisting the product owner, but we don't want this conduit where product owner passes requirements through an analyst, and then the analyst passes requirements to development team members. So the need for analysis is not diminished at all. In fact, it might be even stronger than ever. But we don't want to silo any particular skill set within a development team, which is something that sadly I see happening all the time.
Great, thank you, Russell. So I want to thank everybody for their time today. We have a lot of questions we didn't get to, and Russell will follow up with those via email. And you know, this will be recorded, so feel free to share it, and you'll get a link shortly. If we can just go on to the next slide real quick. Keep your learning going. We need to continue learning. Part of our mission in life is to continue to grow and continue to learn. In Scrum.org, our mission is to provide that information to help you. So we have different learning paths out there. We've got a Scrum Master, Product Owner, and Leadership learning path. The Developer learning path will be out there within the next week or two. It's free. And if you just go to resources, and you'll see 4 Scrum Masters, 4 Product Owners, you can get right into those learning paths and start learning. They follow the competency model and help you grow. Next slide. And keep coming back. We run this monthly. We run other informational Scrum pulses. If you've got questions, go hit our forums. There are always people answering the questions on the forums based on their experience in what is happening. So with that, again, I'd like to thank the audience. I'd like to thank you, Russell, for taking the time today.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, and have a great day, everyone.